So I'm very happy to be here and to join this seminar today. I'm over at the Divinity School, and although it's very close by, often our paths do not cross. So it's nice to be here today. And I'm delighted to be here with Anu K. Antony, our fellow this year. And it's been my privilege to know Anu this year and to hear about her work and to support her in ways that I can, although by far, as you'll see today, she is the expert on the matters about which she speaks. So a very brief introduction. I'm sure many of you already know her and know her work. So Anu has a PhD in sociology from Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. In 2016 to 2022, she was a student there and graduated in 2022. Her supervisor was the very well-known and prestigious Professor Rowena Robinson in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences there. And Anu's dissertation topic, constituting a religious subject, calling, prayer, and spiritual labor among Syrian Catholic nuns of Kerala. She has had a number of teaching positions before coming here this year as a fellow. Most recently, in September 2022 to 2023, she was visiting faculty in the social science program at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Tuliapur, and offered courses on social theory, media, culture, and society, sociology of India, and so forth. So she has teaching experience in her background. She's also the editor, and I only learned this by looking at her CV. She's the editor for The Observatory, which is a very interesting blog. I went to the site this morning to take a look at it. An academic blog by the Initiative for the Study of Asian Catholics, based at the National University in Singapore, with many prestigious scholars on the board and so on. And Anu is the editor of their regular blog. She, with Professor Rowena Robinson, have done a number of publications. In 2023, there are two, and I'll just give you these as an example. First, Called to God, Event Narration and Subject Formation in the Vocation of a Catholic Nun, came out in April of 2023. And then the second one, Prayer as an Actant, Freedom and Sociality in the Subject Formation of a Catholic Nun in Kerala, came out in Social Compass in June of last year. I could go on about this, but simply point out that Anu has another article coming out soon, Being Obedient Daughters, the Imagination of a Catholic Family and the Syro-Malabar Women's Congregations. That'll be out in a book, Catholicism, Family, and Asian Societies, coming out this year. So her project, I think we'll be hearing about part of it today, under this intriguing title, Reimagining Labor Through Religion, Subjectivity and Spiritual Labor Among Syrian Catholic Nuns of Kerala. So we're delighted to be here to hear Anu speaking today.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clooney. That was a very detailed introduction. And thank you all for making time to attend this. And so my research is on the Catholic nuns of South India. And my attempt through this research is to capture the experience of Catholic nuns calling, everyday life, labor, and certain other aspects as well within their congregational cultures. So in doing this, I explore the sociological and anthropological discourses of subjectivity, labor, gender, actant, event, and so on, and also work with the categories of subjectivation, agency, and freedom. So this is broadly like what I'm trying to do, and like a brief introduction of my research, and I'll get into it in detail now. So like any other scholar who attempted to look into the lives of religious women, I also started with the very basic question of why would a young woman decide to join a convent, sacrificing her freedom and worldly desires, especially in a world of overexposure and opportunities. And also the second question would be like, why would a woman decide to continue in this life? Like it is a life with a lot of regulations, and it is a life where you have to restrict yourself. It is a life where you have to live in a particular way according to a particular discipline. And why would she, like, even if she decided to join, why would she decide to continue in this? And to frame this question more sociologically, we can ask that, like, following the post-secular feminist scholar Saba Muhammad, who asks a similar question in the context of the Muslim women who are part of the piety movement in Egypt, Cairo. She frames the question like this: why does a woman, a religious subject, submit herself to the authority of a patriarchal religious institution and consider the submission inevitable to achieve her potentiality? So this is the initial question with which I'm starting my research. So I'll just give a basic brief introduction on what my field is like and what my methodological strategy entails now. So my research is mainly based on two major indigenous Syrian Catholic congregations of Kerala, the Congregation of the Mother of Carmel and a second congregation, which I call by the name Congregation B. The name of the second congregation is anonymized following the request of its Mother Superior. And also, keeping with the ethnographic traditions, all the names of the informants who participated in the study have been changed, and pseudonyms have been used, like, to protect their privacy, basically. Yeah. So the Congregation of Mother Carmel is one of the orders that bifurcated from the first indigenous congregation established in Kerala in the year 1866 under the congregation, the Third Order of Carmelites Discalced. So both these congregations, CMC as well as the Congregation B, are congregations that are affiliated to the Syro-Malabar Church of Kerala, a Roman Catholic church that follows the West Syrian liturgical tradition. So this church has a very interesting history in the sense that it is part of the papal hierarchy, but at the same time, it follows the West Syrian liturgical tradition. And this goes back to the 16th century. And there is like an interesting history of effects that has resulted in this interesting way in which the church exists now. So the fieldwork in the convents belonging to these two congregations were conducted between the years 2017 and 19, and it spanned over a time period of 18 months. So you can see, like, the fieldwork was conducted basically in 3 districts of Kerala. This is a map of Kerala. So the districts that are marked in white are the districts where most of my fieldwork has been was conducted. Yeah. So apart from this, brief visits were also made to 2 convents in Karnataka and Preston City in England as well. So that's, yeah. So I'll briefly explain my methodological strategy now. So my research combines the archival and ethnographic methods. The ethnographic fieldwork included participant observation, multiple informal conversations, and multiple in-depth interviews. I basically followed the nuns everywhere possible in their workplaces, attended events and meetings, and also stayed with them in different convents, both inside and outside Kerala and also outside India. So being an insider to their religious tradition definitely helped, though I was an outsider to religious life per se. And I also always stress this point that this is one of those fields which is accessible only to a female ethnographer. So it is in that way also very particular and peculiar, yeah. So that's briefly about the ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted. And the archives that I'm exploring for this research is the archives of the Kunamawa Convent. So Kunamawa Convent is the first convent that was established in Kerala that I just mentioned under the congregation Third Order of Carmelites Discalced in the year 1866. So the archival materials of Kunamawa Convent contains various significant documents such as the Chronicles of Kunamawa Convent, which is a fascinating document, various letters of correspondence, the records of daily expenditure, account books, the details of due endurance, and the like. So the most important document that I use in my research here, and also the document that I go back every now and then from the contemporary ethnographic descriptions, is also this chronicle of the Chronicles of the Kunamawa Convent. The reason for this is because this is a diary of an entire convent. This is not something where the narratives of individual nuns are recorded, but this functions as a diary of the entire convent, and it gives a lot of significant and crucial information to us about the very first convent that was established in India. So it also tells us the story of how convent as an institution was established and how it evolved over a period of time. It gives us the everyday processes that goes into this. So you can see in these maps that Kunamavu is like marked here in the present day Ernakulam district of Kerala, and this is an old map. This is a map before the state of Kerala was formed. So the state of Kerala was formed after independence in 1956, and before that it is Travancore and Cochin states. Those are the native states of princely states of Cochin and Travancore, and Verapoli is like somewhere here, when I can't see it now. But yeah, it is over here. And Kunama was located in the Verapoli Provarti. Provarti is the smallest administrative unit, and it was called Provarti at that point of time. So in my research, basically, I combined the details from these archival documents with the ethnographic descriptions from the ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in the contemporary times with the contemporary nuns. So moving on to, yeah. So what then comprises the religious life of a nun in our times? The nuns often use the metaphor of a pilgrimage or a journey to describe their vocation. As they explain it, it is a journey towards heaven, an afterlife, or salvation, or to meeting their beloved God. Life in this world, as they explained it to me, for them is a transit or a path which is something in between before they like reach the other world to unite with God. So it's not the actual and primary life that they're having here. It's a transit which they're spending before they actually reach their goal, which is afterlife. Yeah. So as I observed it, and also for the purposes of analysis, this journey can be divided into three parts, or this journey could be understood as having three main parts. The first part is where the nun hears a call from God and decides to respond to this call. And the second part is where she takes a decision regarding this call and continues her religious life by entering a congregation. And the third part, as I understand it, and as also the nuns explain it, is where the nun seeks to fulfill the purpose of this call by doing or engaging in the work of God. So these are the three parts. These are roughly like a division that I made in order to like understand or analyze the everyday lives of nuns. So I explained all this to give you a basic introduction to my research and what it entails and what the methodology and the field entails. And now I'll go on to the narratives of calling. So before going on to discussing the labor of nuns, which is the focus of this presentation, I will briefly explain the experience of a nun's calling, because this is the calling is a process. Calling is considered as the most important event of a nun's life, because that is where she first decides to like embrace religious life. So this is closely connected to her subjectivity and subject formation as well. And understanding a nun's subjectivity is very important in understanding what I call a spiritual labor, or the work ethic that is fashioned out of the practice of a nun's labor. So I'll start with calling. Calling is considered by the nuns as the most important experiences of their life. It is the moment in which they first took the decision to live a religious life. So I usually, when I do ethnographic fieldwork, I usually start the conversation with a nun by asking their calling experience, the story of how they decided to embrace religious life or join a congregation. So every nun had a very memorable story regarding how they decided to choose religious life. And most of the nuns whom I spoke with reached the decision after having a significant experience of calling, or they had something like to tell about what calling entailed for them. So experiences of excruciating pain, invincible persuasion by God, extreme pleasure, hearing voices, seeing signs, unexplainable coincidences, what were described as miracles, and even healing become crucial in finding an answer or arriving at a decision. And it is important to point out that the story always took the form of a narrative, which means that it always had a beginning, a middle part, and an ending. In the first part of my research, I analyzed the narratives of a nun's calling. I'll give a couple of examples from the field notes to show the diverse and unique nature of the narratives of calling. The first narrative that I'm reading here is from Sister Maya. I'm reading from the field notes, and this is a fascinating narrative. I try to read it in almost all my presentation, because this is a very unique experience. And when I had this conversation with Sister Maya on her calling experience, she had completed 17 years in her congregation. Sister Maya's calling narrative is one of my favorite narratives from the field. I already mentioned it. Sister Maya had no intentions to join a convent, but somehow she ended up attending a vocation promotion retreat because her best friend wanted to attend it when she was a teenage girl. She was a young woman. So she was accompanying her best friend. And but however, during the sessions of this retreat, Sister Maya started like something, the meditation and the sessions of this retreat started having an effect on Sister Maya. And then she was like, she started considering religious life seriously during this retreat. So I caught Sister Maya here. Once you recognize the call, you have to take a decision. I was 17 when this invincible voice started reiterating with me. A simple question relentlessly recurred within me during the days of the retreat. And the question was, can you live for me? Can you? Can you? It kept on repeating and it did bother me. How am I supposed to answer the call? So I asked her, but how do you know it is a call from God? Sister Maya responds, it's an instinct and it's invincible. I recognized it instantly. It's like thirst that you have to quench it immediately, or like a severe pain that you have to palliate it. It makes you vulnerable, confused, and yet feel blessed. She paused, looked at my contemplating face, laughed out loud, and dismissed my capability to understand it, and continued. You have to experience it. It is impossible to explain. She nodded with a playful, proud smile. I kept talking back to the voice. This is Sister Maya talking. So Sister Maya saying, I kept talking back to the voice. I negotiated with God. I demanded for signs to tide through my confusions and respond to the call. If God speaks through signs and if he wants me to live for him, I wanted him to communicate with me in a comprehensible language. I refused to give in easily and demanded a sign. But then the problem is, even if God gives you a sign, how will you identify it? So he has to give me a sign. He has to give the sign that you ask for. The campus where this retreat was taking place is a beautiful one with a river at the back. I was sitting on the steps of that riverside during an evening refreshment break and looking at the calm river. I had this random thought that if I can spot some fishes leaping over the water, I'll take the decision to live for him. It was the most unlikely thing to happen, and to be honest, at the back of my mind, I wanted to get rid of this invincible voice. But beyond all my logical reasoning, I spotted fishes leaping out of water. Not just once, and I'm not exaggerating, it continued for almost 15 minutes. One after another, fishes leaped out of water. I could not believe my eyes. I was scared. I felt like screaming. I shivered and experienced what ultimate pleasure means. She looked at me again and laughed out and said, all this might sound foolish and illogical to you, but this happened. God is so near for the ones who experience him. He will even play along. You can almost see him. You just have to get it. So that was Sister Maya's calling narrator. And one can see that Sister Maya's calling experience was a very unique one here. But not all calling narratives are like this one. For instance, there is the example of Sister Anjali's calling, where she experienced a severe physical discomfort during a long train journey, and the discomfort only stopped when she finally arrived at a decision to embrace religious life. Sister Anjali had been pondering over considering religious life for some time, and she was not able to arrive at a decision. And this happens and like manifested as a physical pain according to her, and she finally took the decision and she was free of the pain. And Sister Sharon, on the other hand, always knew that she wanted to become a nun. She had no other choices in mind. There is no particular instance of calling that she recalls, but she knew that she'll join a congregation after her junior college. Sister Maria joined with her sister and continued in religious life even when her sister changed her mind later. So there are also some other nuns who look back and realize that some of the experiences from their past was actually part of their calling, but they realize it later when they actually become a nun after becoming a nun or entering a congregation. So calling experiences are very diverse and unique and personal to each nun, and this takes the shape of a narrative because they may have repeatedly um, they may be repeatedly retelling it at different instances. So I understand calling as a narrated event here. Following the French philosopher Alain Badiou, so Badiou understands event as something which proposes a new truth to an individual, and the individual's fidelity to this truth brings in a radical rupture or transformation to her life. So after an event, an individual will not remain the same. Calling in this sense is an event. A young woman so arriving at a decision to embrace religious life may have to repeat the story of her calling experience, probably to her family to convince them about her decision, the congregation she's approaching to also to convince them how serious she is in becoming a nun. And she may have to describe her calling experience to her spiritual counselors during her formation and religious training within her institution. And As a novice, she's also asked to like contemplate on her calling multiple times at various points during her training to discern her vocation properly. So there are like these multiple times during which a nun is actually asked to revisit the initial moment of her calling experience. And in this way, like the narrative of calling takes a very structured and rehearsed form. So that is why I understand this as a narrated event. And why I understand this as a narrated event is also because the institutional formation during which the event of calling is repeatedly revisited has a significant role in structuring these narratives. And I understand this also as expression of her belief, because this acts as a testimony of her belief as well. So these narratives are formed through the process of institutional religious formation, and this process is very much connected to the very existence or very formation of her subjectivity. So calling is interrelated to her subjectivity, and the subjectivity is formed or evolved out of the everyday life that she lives within her discipline, within her congregation's disciplinary structures. So I'll move on to the aspect of subjectivity now. So subject formation can be simply defined as the process through which a nun constitutes herself as a religious subject. It is only possible through a nun's repetitive and laborious everyday participation in her congregation's disciplinary regulations, routines, and missions. The congregational life for a nun is an everyday process through which she reconstitutes herself and moves closer to God. For her, the life in this world, as I already mentioned, is a mere transit, an in-between liminal space where she serves God before uniting with him in the afterlife. Her social relationships, her work, her prayer are all processes through which she gets closer and closer to her God. Living according to the vows and following the work and prayer routines and discipline of monastic life, all this forms the technologies of self within the religious life, if you understand it in a larger Foucauldian sense. So what do we mean by technologies of self here? To understand the everyday subject formation of a nun, I use the concept of subjectivation by the French philosopher Michel Foucault in my research a lot. I borrow from Foucault a lot in my research, along with other philosophers as well. The subjectivation inherently includes what Foucault explains as the technologies of self-formation, or the technologies of self. And the technologies of the self are the practices that permit individuals to effect by their own means a certain number of operations on their own bodies, their own souls, their own thoughts, or their own conduct, and in this manner so as to transform themselves, modify themselves, and to attain a certain state of perfection, happiness, purity, or supernatural power. So this includes this very process of a nun constituting herself as a religious subject with her rigorous participation in her congregation's cultures, and like in her congregation's regulations and disciplinary regimes. What is happening here is like she's, through her everyday processes, through her everyday life, molding herself as a religious subject who can please God more and more. So whatever she does, all the everyday activities that she is doing within her congregation is actually adding to the molding or constituting of herself as a religious subject, which is making her better in that sense within the religious life. So that is a brief, like very, very basic brief explanation of what I mean by subjectivity and what I mean by constituting a religious subject. So we can come back to this more during the Q&A session. I'm now moving on to the next slide. And this is like the continuation of what I discussed. So what becomes extremely important here is also that, in understanding the religious life of a nun and the aspects of it, including calling, everyday monastic life, and labor, what becomes extremely important here is that we have to now make room for a divine entity. Like God now becomes an analytical category in a deeply sociological discussion. Because for the nuns, the God is real and immediate and intimate, and like as Sister Maya says, like he even plays along. So how to like accommodate God in a very secular, quote unquote secular sociological discussion here is like also, and how to like understand this divine entity as an analytical category is also a question that I'm dealing with. So So in my research, the God who is intimate to the nun is also an analytical category and one node in a tripartite relationship between the monastic, the social, and the religious. So what I understand as the subjectivity of a nun then is a result of both her initial singular experience of calling and the everyday processes that she undergoes within her congregation. It is not separate from each other. So it is both singular, individual, her individual motivations and her very unique experience of calling is also required. That is not enough. She has to continue this call within the repetitive and laborious processes by participating in the disciplines of her congregation. So this is what I understand as the larger subjectivity of a Catholic nun. So now moving on to the spiritual labor. Spiritual labor, the way I define it is spiritual labor is a work ethic that is structured or fashioned out of this subjectivity. It is something that is intertwined with the subjectivity. A nun's work is an extension of her calling and an act of witness in this world. As many nuns have pointed out to me, through their work, they are making an attempt to proclaim God's love to the poor and the marginalized. At the same time, this work also brings in financial resources required for the community's everyday upkeep and expenses. So when we bring in the term labor, it then necessitates the situating of Catholic Church also as an economic institution. Move to the next slide. However, by doing this, one is not intending to undermine its role as a religious institution. And what I'm trying to highlight is that even if they are not primarily economic institutions, the monasteries and congregations are also locations of economic activity. The maintenance and expansion of the congregations studied in this thesis are managed to the income generated by their members who work in different government-aided and private institutions owned by them. Here one can see that the labor of their members is crucial not only in the everyday running of these institutions, but also in enabling accumulation and expansion. At the same time, even when understood as economic institutions, it is to be acknowledged that the congregations are not profit-making enterprises in the conventional sense. So from the beginning of the first convent in Kerala onwards, one can see that the early nuns were entrusted with the duties of teaching young women and also running boarding houses. So they started their first school in 1871, just 5 years after the establishment of the convent. They started running boarding houses even before that, immediately after the establishment of the first convent. So I'll quickly give a historical context of the region as well to situate the work of nuns in the context of South India. So the second half of 19th century Kerala, it was not Kerala then, it was like the native states of Travancore and Kochi. It was also a period when there was an increased demand for literacy and education due to the jobs created by the increasing commercialization of the economy. The Protestant missionaries had already established various schools in different parts of Travancore and Kochi in the beginning of 18th and 19th centuries itself. Also, the governments which ruled the states in the 19th century adopted various schemes for development of the educational sector and literacy by providing liberal grant and aids for schools under private management. So the missionary schools definitely gained from all this, and then soon the Catholic Church also entered into the scene of education. Furthermore, the scholarship on the late 19th century Kerala also reveals how productivity was becoming the norm by which social institutions and domestic life began to be assessed during this time. And the value of an institution depended on its possibility of being transformed into a productive one. So religious and monastic institutions just existing as religious institutions made their significance lesser and lesser important in the society. So like there was also an increasing need for portraying these institutions that they're owning as socially relevant and important for the country. So in this context, this also means defining what the nuns and their institutions can do for the society. So according to the feminist scholar and historian J. Deviga, this was also a time when home as a category was becoming increasingly expected to be the site in which children were not only brought forth, but also raised to be obedient, useful, and productive subjects. The duty of an ideal mother then was not just to give birth and raise to her children, but to raise them as productive individuals. The Catholic congregations of the 19th century can be seen as perceiving themselves as playing a role in producing ideal mothers who were in turn capable of raising disciplined, obedient, and productive children. So the celebratory writings which elaborate the contributions of Kerala women's congregations stress their role in molding women as ideal mothers and homemakers. The educational institutions run by nuns can be seen as gaining acceptance and popularity against this backdrop of a reforming Malayali society, where the convent schools were assessed as institutions where the formation of students could be assured. And the convent schools still have a huge popularity, like any institutions owned by the Catholic missionaries or like the Christian missionaries have a huge popularity in Kerala, and they are like I mean, there is a huge trust that the society keeps on these institutions. So the nuns soon started engaging in different kinds of jobs over the years, and the nature of their labor and profession has evolved over time. They have started doing new jobs such as social work, practicing as lawyers, and there are a lot of doctors who are nuns now. However, the most common jobs done by the nuns still remain teaching and various medical professions. The relationship between nuns and the profession of nursing is also well established in the scholarship. I'll now explain how this labor was conceived in the among the early nuns, and how this labor was like understood, or how the nuns, early nuns, or even the contemporary nuns are expected to perform this labor. And for this, I'll go back to the archives again, and I'll read out a letter that is like there in the archives. This is written to the nuns by one of their founders. It is an Italian Carmelite missionary called Leopold Beccaro. So this first congregation was established by two male priests. One is a native priest called Chavra Kuriakos, and the co-founder is somebody called Father Leopold Beccaro. He is an Italian Carmelite missionary. He was in Kerala serving the Vedapalli diocese of Kerala at that point of time. So this letter is by him addressing the nuns on how to perform the labor. So the letter starts. Dear daughters, I had this thought yesterday that you all have started showing some amount of lethargy and disinterest in doing the labor here. This may be okay for the time being. However, I would like to remind you that this will lead to great disasters in future. The order of our congregation gives importance to the renewal of our souls through solitude, meditation, and practice of silence, and also then teaching as well as doing other relevant work. I was pondering over the possible reasons for your lethargy and disinterest in doing Vela. Vela is the Malayalam word used for labor. As you said, I figured out that firstly, you do not have that unconditional love towards Jesus Christ in your hearts. Secondly, you do not love others for God, but by considering their characteristic peculiarities and behavior. So he's also like, this letter is also assuming the form of a slight scolding as well as advice. You are talking about and meditating on Jesus. Nevertheless, you lack unconditional love towards him. If you possess that unconditional love, nothing is difficult. Dear children, unlike slaves, I stress it here, unlike slaves, and the Malayalam word used for this is adiyar, we should do things with love. Haven't you seen how slaves display their tiredness and detachment while coming to receive their daily wages in the evening? At the same time, the landlord's son, who supervised the entire day's work, comes back without a sign of exhaustion on his face. He displays the happiness and satisfaction of accomplished labor. After coming back home from a whole day's work in the field, he'll still be enthusiastic enough to inquire what is to be done next. Like this, if everybody considers this as our work, without selfishness, everything will fall in place. For the sake of your vow of obedience, you should try to accomplish all the labor expected from you with utmost fervor and enthusiasm. Sanctitude cannot be achieved merely through reading holy books, reciting routine prayers with piety, and doing things according to your will. If you are finishing your work with obedience and serving others, you can achieve sainthood even without reciting holy books. So the letter ends here. So clearly, this letter brings out the demand for the complete involvement and dedication when the nun is performing her work. So it is not just expected, but as can be seen in the letter, it is perceived as an extension of her religious vows. She has no choice but to be completely attached to her work. At the same time, a nun is also asked to detach from everything that is this worldly. For instance, in the archives itself, we can find descriptions where a nun is asked to not even refer to anything that she uses in her daily life as her possession. For instance, it is clearly asked by the founders to the nuns that if, for instance, the plate used by Sister Anna, the founders are asking the nuns to focus on how they are using the language in their everyday lives. Like they're asked to not use the Sister Anna's plate or Sister Mary's plate, but instead they're asked to use like phrases like the plate used by Sister Anna or the plate used by Sister Mary. So which means that they are not supposed to be attached to any of the material possessions that they use in their everyday life. So there is this demand of attachment and detachment at the same time. They're asked to be very attached to their work and at the same time be very detached to any of the worldly possessions or aspirations or ambitions, because their life is not this worldly. Their life is imagined as like in the other world. So everything that they do in this world is for the empire of Jesus Christ, for the God's empire. It is God's work. So that is what makes it different from the typical Marxian conceptualizations of labor. And that is where I come up with I define spiritual labor as a particular work ethic, which is conceptualized outside the ideas of alienation, commodity, or surplus value, and so on, which are the categories with which labor is defined within the Marxian framework. But I cannot also say that it is completely disengaging with the Marxian framework, because if you look at the early writings of Marx, like for instance, the 1844 manuscripts of Marx, you can see that he has a much more philosophical and larger idea of labor, where he sees labor as an extension of man and where he elevates the entire idea of labor as something that man continuously does. So it's not completely, it cannot be said that spiritual labor exists completely outside the Marxian framework, but it is clearly delineating from the ways in which labor is imagined within the Marxist and feminist traditions so far. I mean, or the major feminist and Marxian traditions or explanations of labor. So because this is where I think, like, is it possible to reimagine labor outside the concept of alienation? Because what is most important here is that the nun is expected to show complete dedication and attachment to her work, and is considered important to, and this is the most important part. She has to show complete attachment, and this is important for the fulfillment of her very subjectivity or her very existence as a religious subject. She ceases to become a religious subject if she is not involving in this with complete heart and soul. So this is an extension of her religious self. That is where this labor is becoming very peculiar. Yeah. So the work of a nun is unique in the sense that the very conceptualization of this work focuses on the elimination of estrangement from the work. She's asked to labor away her estrangement. She's asked to, like, constantly and continuously fight against this detachment towards her work. And that is how spiritual labor becomes a very different work ethic. So the institutional discipline and obedience here, even when these control her body and senses, do not yoke her soul and spirit. Her decision to do the work of God is imagined as an autonomous, willing decision and is rooted in the vows of religious life. At the same time, it is not something that a nun can undertake in a mechanical or detached manner. Her complete dedication and soulful involvement in what she does is expected, as already mentioned. It is labor motivated by complex meanings of spirituality. The demands of this labor are not just time and presence, but one's entire self and spirit. So in short, the fundamental question that I'm posing is that whether a Christian call, truth, freedom, and discernment can contribute towards both reinforcing and critiquing the capitalistic models of labor, and whether it is possible to re-articulate the notion of labor from this position. So I'll stop the discussion on spiritual labor here, and we can take up questions regarding this during the Q&A session. Before wrapping up, I'll quickly move on to the next slide and discuss or locate spiritual labor in the history of the region or in the contemporary present of the region. So the labor of nuns can be definitely said as influencing the professional choices of lower middle class and middle class women from Kerala. The gendered nature of spiritual labor is such that it cannot only be said as influencing the gendered professional choices of women from the region, but this work ethic was also something that is structured within the larger cultural sphere of Kerala. So the formation and conceptualization of spiritual labor should be also understood as something that evolved within the cultural space of South India, along with the Catholic notions of labor and various reformations that followed within the Catholic tradition. So I already briefly explained about how nuns were active in teaching earlier. Like I it was very brief, but yeah, it gave an idea of like how teaching was one of their earliest professions, and like how they were expected to be, what kind of teachers were they expected to be, and how they presented their institutions as socially useful and productive. So to give another instance of how like the spiritual labor or this particular work ethic is influencing the career choices of middle class women. The history of nursing in India is also closely associated with the nuns of South India. Although European Catholic nuns introduced nursing as a profession in Kerala, so nursing is invariably connected to the religious life, because it was a group of Spaniard nuns who came to Kerala as the first nurses. The Maharaja of Travancore appointed them as to serve in the General Hospital of Trivandrum, which is the capital of present-day Kerala. So it is essentially, it is very much tied to the idea of religious life. So as a profession involving touch and the handling of bodily fluids, nursing was not considered suitable for respectable women. However, the stigma related to nursing started to diminish as the indigenous Catholic nuns also started taking up the profession of nursing around or after independence. More and more women started taking up the profession of nursing, as the presence of nuns in the field gave a sacred image to it. It in a way legitimized the profession and took the stigma away from it. So it is also well observed by scholars that the state of Kerala later, post-independence, became the major supplier of nurses throughout hospitals across India and abroad as well, in the years after independence especially. But however, scholars also note that this legacy did not actually help the nurses in the long run. So I quote Madeline Healy here. Mrs. Chandramadi, pioneer of nursing in Kerala and the first assistant director of nursing appointed there, felt that the strong association of nursing with Catholic nuns in the early days of its development left a very problematic legacy for the state and encouraged the migration of Malayali nurses to other states. With their strong emphasis on service and self-sacrifice, the nuns had been willing to work in such poor conditions that they had reinforced the stigmatization of nurses and created a tradition of low pay and exploitation. In general, the connection of Indian nursing with religious sisters linked the work of nursing still more firmly to Christian community and strengthened the discourse of obedience, service, and self-sacrifice that already infused nursing. So one can see that like the association with the nuns, or like the idea of spiritual labor or this particular work ethic, is not always positive for the career choices or professional professions of women who were influenced by the work of nuns. So it is both positive and it is also negative. It has its like limiting effects also on the professions of women on the region, but it also has been very crucial in popularizing, taking away the stigma of certain professions, and also popularizing certain professions, and also defining what kind of professions are ideal for women, especially Christian women, and also women from other communities as well. So I'll stop here, and I'll answer more in the question and answer session.
Great, thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Anu, for a fine, interesting presentation. So many things we can talk about. I think I'll take my prerogative as the moderator here to ask the first question, and maybe I'll have one later on as well. One of the most interesting, you described the vocational stories very beautifully.
Yeah.
And have that, and then how it plays out in terms of what it means to be in the religious community among the other nuns and so on. All of that is quite beautiful. And I'm thinking that there are different lenses through which to read this, even before you get to the Marxism or the contemporary scene. So the ethos of the religious orders that comes from Europe, back in the Benedictine tradition,
Yeah.
for nuns, and the idea of prayer and work and so on like that, entering the community, self-abnegation and so on. All of that seems to make sense. And I'm wondering if in Kerala, which is a fascinating location to think about these things, both archivally and today, where you have large Hindu and Muslim communities as well as Christian communities. Is it also in the culture that a woman would be expected to have this kind of service mentality, as a daughter, as a mother, as a wife, and then put her own good in the background over against the needs of others and never be thinking of herself, and that these women would be sort of ready for that. And then finally, on the other side, in terms of, let's say, and this is very loose because I don't have any examples really, but in terms of Hindu models of seva, karma yoga, men or women who go into ashrams, Chinmaya mission, Ramakrishna order, and so on. Is it easier? Does it work culturally better because of family expectations on the one side, and then the fact that this would not be unfamiliar in Hindu monastic traditions and so on, this idea of abnegation of self?
Yeah, I'll answer this question or take more questions.
Maybe you can answer, what would you, I think doing them one at a time might be better.
Yeah, I think that.
And,
So, yeah,
and
I'll
then
answer
the
this
floor
question.
will
So,
come afterwards, yeah.
actually, the vocational, before coming to Marxism, like I just focused on the Marxian framework and the engagement with Marxism just to like also, firstly, because of time limitation. In my research, I'm engaging with other scholars as well, like starting from the Benedict of Nursia to like the medieval monastic scholars and the discussions on medieval monasticism to like Agamben's idea of liturgical labor. Like, so the discussion, if you look at if you try to place the labor that exists within the female monastic orders, it's like a vast, it's a vast discourse. Vast discussion. It's a lot of literature that is coming. So the culture of Kerala has definitely been important in understanding how this particular work ethic evolved from the 1850s onwards, or even before that, because Kerala is also a space where, or before Kerala, the Travancore and Kochi, or what we understand as the region now, was also a space where there were a lot of missionary interventions. And later in the 20th century, one can see the leftist movement also becoming quite stronger there. And it's also very multi-religious in existence. Different communities coexist in the space. And at the same time, like this part with that I'm looking at Kunamava, for instance, where the first convent was established, it was a place in the 18th or the 17th century. It was also a place where there were significant Jewish, Muslim, and Christian and Hindu population, and all the religious worship places, significant religious worship places, can also be seen as having a strong presence in this particular locality. So it's a very multicultural, multi-religious region. If you look at it, like the first mosque in Kerala was established in 625, just 25 years after Islam even originated in the in the Arab context. So in that sense, the culture was very peculiar, and also like the colonial interventions that happened from the 15th century onwards has brought in the ideas of Catholicism. So it's like it's a mix of all this, if I understand it. And coming to the question of whether the Hindu monastic or what options the Hindu women have, I haven't seen any references of Hindu women going into monastic life before 15th century, or I think 12th century. There is one reference written by a scholar, but we don't have much information about it. So we have no idea how that existed before the 15th century. A lot of these present day monastic institutions that belong to Hinduism can be seen as they have so much similarities to the way in which the Christian missionary institutions are also functioning. So I kind of want to say that this has mutual influence, or like this has influenced the formation of Hindu monastic institutions, but I wouldn't assert it because I don't have enough information about it. But I think that has evolved together. And the presence of Catholic congregations, also the missionaries who are coming from various European countries, was there from the 15th century onwards. The Portuguese missionaries, it was, so to speak a bit about this church, like it was in the 16th century that they joined the papal hierarchy, because this is the group of St. Thomas Christians who were associated with the Syrian Church, and before that they had no connection with the Catholicism. It is with the Portuguese colonial missionaries that they got introduced to Catholicism, and then there's like a series of revolts and a history of conflicts and it's a very effective history, through which, so finally, the St. Thomas Christians divided into many denominations. One of them is like the Syrian Catholics, and they, following the Coonan Cruz oath and the Synod of Diamber, they have finally decided or come to an agreement where they remain within the papal hierarchy, but they were not willing to give up the liturgical tradition from Syria. So they follow the West Syrian liturgical tradition and remain part of Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a very interesting church to start with.
Yeah.
So culturally, it's a very, if you look from the 15th century onwards, to the 20th or the contemporary times, culturally, it's a very complex region, with all the missionary encounters, with all the debates on, I speak about slave as against a daughter when I talk about the spiritual labor. So even the debates on slavery, one can see that it was initiated by the Protestant missionaries. If one refers to the work of historians like Sanal Mohan or scholars like that, one can see that it is the missionaries also started a lot of discourses which led to the modernity or so the modernity of Kerala could be understood only by placing it in this larger context.
Right.
Yeah, so I think I kind of
No,
answered
that's
your question.
wonderful, yes. So I think you can just field your own questions, so you can just see who raises their hand first and go from there.
So on a related note, I was curious, and this is something I don't know if there's an answer for, but are there unique theological traditions that inform the development of subjectivity, which seems a critical piece of the spiritual labor, that subjectivity is that first step? Are there unique, because they hold this particular place as a spurious church within the Catholic tradition, are there theological influences that inform the way that these nuns develop their own subjectivity, or is it something that, because they're part of the Catholic Church, is more easily comparable to the more traditional styles of monasteries and that we see in other parts of the West?
So the first convent that was established in India, in Kerala, it is also the first convent that is established in India. So that the influence of the Jesuit and Italian missionaries, particularly the Italian Carmelite missionaries, was huge on the establishment of this convent. Because even though the founder is one of the founders is a native priest who was trained in the native seminaries of the region, it should be understood that the regimes, there were two regimes of Jesuit missionaries and the Carmelites, which was ruling or which was controlling the Catholic Church of Kerala at that point of time. And when you look at the archives, one can see that the formation of this institution from its beginning, the founders have consciously and meticulously contributed towards the formation or the development of this institution. And in this, one can see that in the archives it is written that they have brought booklets or the biographies of Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint John the Cross. So the ideas of European monasticism is directly brought to this context. And there were instances where the nuns described that how they were asked to read the biography of Saint Teresa of Avila in Latin. So the priests will come every Friday to give them a weekly advice, and then they will read out the biography because the nuns didn't know the language. So one can see that the influence of European monasteries and the cultural, the congregational cultures that existed there at that point of time has directly impacted the formation of Kunamma convent, the first convent of Kerala. But there is also one can also see, because of the presence of the native priest as the founder, and also these women are Malayali women who grew up in Kerala, and also this was existing within the Kerala Catholic Church. The cultural influences also can be seen as playing a huge role in this entire process. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to know, you mentioned that there were pluralistic religion, people belonging to pluralistic religions living in Canada. I would be interested to know, I don't know whether you've looked into it or not, but what was the labor of females before the church took over. Because these two professions that are associated, one is teaching and the other is nursing, are considered to be very noble professions. So what the women of Kerala doing before that?
Which is a very interesting question, because the schools, like as formal institutions, or hospitals as formal institutions, I think like took place around this time, like post 15th century. I can safely say that it's post 15th century probably. Before that, I have not really looked into the literature of what women's labor was before that, because uh, when we look at the literature on Kerala modernity, one can see that a lot of women started taking professional training around this period of time, like 17th, 18th, and 19th, and probably 20th century. Like, so even in 17th century, very few references. I couldn't trace many, but yeah. But when it reaches 20th century, one can see that women are the Kerala modernity, like the discussions on Kerala modernity is also like placed around that time. And then the missionary institutions have already like established a lot of uh, professional institutions. And then there are missionaries who are women who are actually working in the region, like for the education of women, young women, or also like in establishing mission institutions in the healthcare sector and all that. So I think like the first Protestant missionary school, I don't remember the year exactly, was in 17th century by the LMS and CMS missionaries in Kottayam, if I'm not wrong. And I think that was the first school for young women. Before that, I don't think women were educated, and the missionaries introduced the female education. And I think from there onwards is what I mean, is when it starts what we now understand as the modern education and the training for the modern education. So I think, yeah. Yes, yes. You can go first. Yeah.
Um, this was so great to hear all of.
Thank you, Mia.
And I was wondering, you brought up how God tips things in terms of thinking about the labor, and I was curious if in your methods or writing, you have a relationship to the idea of spiritual labor and how you're doing this project.
Yeah. So I didn't go into that in this presentation, but so in my methods also, I use the concept of actant by Bruno Latour, and I understand prayer as an actant in the life of Catholic nuns, because an actant is something that motivates an actor to do something. So prayer, one can see that like prayer is a very important aspect in the life of a nun, and then prayer becomes in various ways an act and a motivation, or like something that motivates a nun to act in a particular way in the very constitution of herself. So South Asia, if you like, when we talk about South Asia, it's a deeply religious society. So anything like if you're trying to understand, forget the case of nuns, but if you're trying to understand any social aspect of South Asia, I think the religious experience and religion has to be understood from a very sociological framework and lens. So in that sense, especially when I'm looking at the intimate everyday lives of religious women where God is like a real presence, most of my nuns have there are descriptions in the field notes where they talk to how they talk to like the God or their favorite saints on an everyday basis. Like, so God is a very real, intimate presence, and they are constantly in communication with God. So there are also instances where, so I only talked about how a woman, a religious woman, molds herself as a religious subject through her everyday life. But there are also instances where a nun is disillusioned with the institution, where she negotiates with the institution, or where she is like, she has criticism towards an institution's particular stand or something. And then sometimes she decides to leave the congregation. And like, so when I talk to former nuns, like, one of my former nuns told me that the decision to join the congregation for her and the decision to leave the congregation for her was the same thing, and it was God. So when she felt that the congregation was moving against God, then she couldn't stay close to the institution anymore, or she couldn't continue in the religious life anymore. So what is important here is that the goal is like to stay close to God. An institution or congregation is just one way to do that for the nun. And for a Catholic girl, it is the most easiest or like the readily available way in front of her, especially in the context of Kerala, where you have a number of convents, like every 100 meters, if you go to Middle Kerala, every 100 meters, you find a convent or a convent school. So it's that culturally present and visible. So, so when you are understanding the religious lives of these women, and especially when you try to understand it from the disciplinary framework of sociology and anthropology, which are considered to be very secular disciplines, and which has a very secular framework, quote unquote secular. It is, it is impossible. So for me, it was impossible to understand or place the lives of Catholic nuns without making space for God. Like, what is God for them? What does this intimacy mean for them? I mean, when it is an everyday presence, a real presence, like maybe like it's, so in one of my other presentations, somebody asked me like, how do you know that it is not a delusion or it is not a psychological, but I think that is not my question. As a sociologist, I kind of try to only focus on how they narrate their experience, how they narrate their religious experience, and how they how they want to see themselves. That's also what we understand by subjectivity. So God becomes an analytical category, and it is, so actant is the concept of actant and understanding prayer as an actant is one way in which I try to understand that, because when I understand the socialities of the nuns within during their work in my research, I also try to like place it as an interconnected relationship between the world of the monastic, the world of the social, and the world of the religious. And religious, and even when you pray, like there are three people involved in it. So especially when the nuns pray, the nuns take a lot of prayer requests. So when she prays, like there is the person who requests the prayer involved, the person who is praying, which is the nun involved, and the person to whom the prayers are directed to. So it's a three-way relationship, and God is ever present in these. So even as a sociologist who tries to like understand it from a very modernist, rationalist framework, we have to somehow find a way to like fit in the analytical category, or develop an analytical category to place this divine entity. So that's what I was trying to do. Yeah. Yeah, he was.
I think you answered my question.
Thank
So I
you.
was just curious about whether there are examples of nuns who leave congregation,
Yes.
and how does that fit into the kind of framework that you have used to analyze decisions?
Yeah.
I think that that's
Thank you for that question, because I would like to talk about it a bit. In the scholarship that looks at the lives of religious women, the similar scholarship that looks at the lives of religious women, one phenomenal work would be the work of Saba Mahmood, like who understands the piety movement of Muslim women in Cairo, Egypt, where she understands and where she offers a different and new perspective to understand and place agency of women, where she says that submitting the decision to submit to a religious institution, the submission should also be understood as an agential act, because it's an autonomous act. So compared to that, like I think like the difference here is that it is not just submission in the case of Catholic nuns, because what is expected of a Catholic nun is to like is to be in constant awareness, is to constantly discern the will of God. So she has to nurture this quality of constant awareness, which is a very critical skill. Like that is where a nun is capable, or like nun is given the capacity, or what she nurtures is also the capacity to like negotiate with the institution. Though in most of the cases that doesn't happen, like most of the nuns continue in religious life and complete their religious life. But I have spoken to a lot of former nuns also, where at some point in their religious life, they developed a disillusionment with the institution, and then they either decided to like negotiate with the institution and fight from within by being a religious woman, by continuing to be a religious woman, or she decides to leave the congregation because the differences become too much. And in that case, like that is why I understand that. So theoretically I develop or I choose to use the category of freedom than agency here, because freedom is like a much more much more wider concept to understand this, because agency somehow this is I quote, I refer to Laidlaw here, James Laidlaw's work here. Agency is somehow understood always in relation to an authority or an institution. So either to submit to an authority, or either to negotiate to an authority, or either to criticize an authority, or um, uh, even in the discourses of empowerment, you are empowering from through something, or about something. So in that sense, agency is limiting for understanding the subjectivity of nuns, because freedom would be a much more wider term, where to represent the autonomy of Catholic nuns. And so I choose freedom over agency, because that also fits this entire debate in the Foucauldian framework, because for Foucault, power relations exist within the frameworks of freedom. So I think that's how I theoretically and analytically place the nuns who are not just submitting, but also negotiating. And this is also understood as part of their religious subjectivity. Yeah.
Firstly, this is fascinating.
Thank you.
And thank you. So my question is about the category Catholic. One way to look at early modern missions and Catholic missions in South India, in India, is that they are trying to create a Catholic subject, which has been a very contentious issue. To make a native Christian, native Catholic, and even more contentious in Kerala, where there are already Christians, but still you have to make native Catholics.
Yeah.
To make a native who's a Catholic. And we do not have much in terms of reception, as in we only have documents of missionaries who came, and we don't have a lot coming from the other side. So this is one of the responses, one of the subject, one of the makers of it. We hear from congregations in one sense. But the letter from Chavra, is it from Chavra?
No, it was from Leopold Beccaro.
Wow, that even changes it, because that's very different from any Catholic letter you see in the 17th century or the 18th century.
Yeah.
Right, there is like a shift in the character of Catholicism. Does that? Yeah. My question is how tenable is that category anymore? Wow. By Catholic here, I think people have very different ideas, and what changes does this propose to ideas of Catholicism? This response. My second question is
sorry.
Hierarchy in the convents.
Yeah.
How I know that you're using Latour and people who kind of have more egalitarian structures of actor network theory, but this is intense hierarchy.
Yes.
So how does, so I'd love to hear about that.
So why do you think the letter is different from can you just give me a little more clarification on what makes you say that the letter is different from the Catholic discourses that existed at that point of time?
Yeah, it just is much more, it's much more contextually rich. It's not just an order anymore from them without understanding what the without understanding what the situation on the ground is, which has been a complaint of Indian congregations, saying that they don't not much has been understood of the Indian context. But this seems like a letter that kind of has a different meaning to Catholicism, which I thought it was Chavra's letter, because I thought, wow, this is so rich. He's saying you really have to labor, but it's in Malayalam, yes, sir.
It's in Malayalam, yeah.
Oh, so this Italian.
All the letters written were in Malayalam by Leopold Beccaro.
Oh.
The missionaries were excellent in learning the language at that point.
Oh, wow. So this is a complete letter in Malayalam that he's using.
Yeah.
he doesn't use pani, but
He uses the word vela,
vela,
yeah,
which is
so which is literally labor, yeah.
live, right? Yeah. So
And he uses the word adiyar for slaves here.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's adding, he's very famous for having in his conception of what nuns should be doing, for having combined bhakti and karma yoga, right? Isn't that what, that's meant to be his,
That's very interesting.
that's meant to be his theological innovation.
Yeah.
He took these two indigenous categories of
Mm.
bhakti yoga and karma yoga and combined them. That's what I remember. I was trying to look it up, but I didn't find it. I'm sorry, but that's what
Yeah.
I seem to remember from.
Um, You're talking about Chawra, right?
No, I'm talking about the Karo.
Are you sure? Like
Yeah,
I think like the idea of labor is like was always there in the very Christian conceptualization itself. Like labor is a very, I mean, I would even say labor is a very Christian idea. Like in the Bible, it's like always there are multiple references of laborers and laborers and labors and like the metaphors that and the images given where I mean there are a lot of instances where labor is being discussed, like for instance like the one that is directly related to like the monastic life, the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few. So Bible itself contains a lot of instances where labor is clearly discussed. So I think it I don't know about like this bhakti and this part, but yeah,
How do you explain it to an Indian?
yeah, maybe like that could be like yeah. So yeah, so this just connection I think is also a very Catholic connection. I think like combining labor and like the attachment, because you have to involve in God's work with all your heart and soul is very biblical. So I think it also when it combines to, it would have been easier for the founders to place this idea in the South Asian context, because the idea of women being obedient and the idea that answers your first question. Also, the idea of women being obedient and staying within the homes, like it's not a new idea for it's like something that was already always there, and it was not difficult for the founders to like bring this discussion into that gendered cultural context. So I think it would have been easier for, and it's like a combination. The Catholic idea or the conception in this particular case, and also the hierarchy just fitted right in the South Asian or South Indian cultural context. So, and also the question of hierarchy, it's a deeply hierarchical institution. But the question again is like what Mahmoud asked, like, why would a woman like choose to submit to this hierarchy? So if in a situation where somebody is thinking that submitting this is probably equivalent to humility or obedience, like the following the vow of obedience is an aspect of fulfilling their religious requirements or the life as a religious woman, then this becomes a different debate, right? This becomes a question of autonomy and freedom and probably agency as well, though I prefer to use the concept of freedom. So yeah, but hierarchies of various sorts exist in this, and it comes up multiple times during the interviews as well, because there are nuns who are clearly against the male hierarchy within the Catholic Church, because in one of the interviews a very a friendly respondent, Sister Nina, like I call her Sister Nina here. So she told me that there is this practice of like the feasts that is being celebrated within the convent, where when a male priest comes, the equation of the entire convent changes. And there will be these older nuns, or some nun will be like serving the priest, standing near to the priest. Like this entire performativity of like how to like be subservient in the gendered framework. That has been like an everyday, that's an everyday practice within the convent. Like even when the congregations are pontifical institutions, which has nothing to do with the local priest of the local parish, they are like so the congregations that I look at, like the first congregation, the CMC has 7,000 plus members, and they have branches across the world. They have branches in America, they have branches in Europe, they have branches in South America. And the mother general of this congregation is a very powerful woman. She controls multiple institutions, and the sisters, the nuns themselves are entrepreneurs, hospital administrators. They are not like subservient, normal everyday women. They also like are very professional women who manage these institutions successfully. And like in South India, especially in Kerala, they have a huge popularity, and their institutions are considered spaces to be which one can depend upon. So even then, when you come to like a scene that happens inside the convent, when a parish priest comes for a feast or like for a dinner or something, then the body language of the nuns change. So Sister Nina like expressed a huge issue with that. Sister Nina's like, I just can't stand it, but I can't do anything about it. And she used to tell the older nuns to not do this. And then she talked to me about an argument that she had with an older nun because she couldn't see it. She said like she had this argument because she loved this older nun than the parish priest because she is more closer to the older nun. But the older nun understood this as like an act of her deviating from the obedience and humility and all that. And also like caste hierarchy. This is Syrian Catholic Church that we are talking about. And even when we established the first convent, the early nuns had members from both the Latin Catholic community and the Syrian Catholic community. In the late 19th century, they split into like the Syrian Rite and Latin Rite. This is like a long history of like, again, caste equations and Syrian Latin conflicts and all that. So it exists as two separate rites now. And the congregations that I'm looking at are Syrian Catholic congregations who consider, you might be familiar with this, who consider themselves as upper caste converts, like converts from Brahmin families. So, and I couldn't find even one Dalit Catholic nun, even when Dalit Catholics are very much part of the Syrian church in the contemporary times. I couldn't find even one single Dalit Catholic nun. And in the interviews, when I tried to like bring this up, the nuns kind of said like, we prefer nuns joining from well-established and well-off families, like non-families. So, like there are these family names that kind of establish their caste position also. And you can see like in the conceptualization of labor also this caste angle is coming in. So when the word slave comes in, and I translate this as slave, I consulted with some historians as well as some other language scholars also, whether adiyar can be translated as slave or like, because in some of the modern hagiographical translations, the word used is servant. But servant doesn't translate well. So I prefer to use the word slave. That also indicates to the caste dynamics of this the Catholic congregations, because the labor is a very caste centered, or like it is imagined within this ideas of caste and notions of caste. That is why you shouldn't work like the slave. That is also one underlying meaning that goes into the idea of spiritual labor. Also, like, it is important to note that the nuns were not expected to do any menial labors. They always, even the contemporary nuns, have servants like in the kitchen. And it is an interesting, I don't know much details about the servant. There is the mention of this one lady who was serving as the cook in the first convent. I couldn't trace I don't exactly know what caste or what family she belongs to. But in the contemporary nuns, one can see that there are a lot of girls or young women who are belonging from the tribal Christian communities of Orissa and other states, like, who are serving in the congregations of Kerala. And they are like, they also consider it as a safe space to spend till they get married off. So because this is like a community of women, and the safety is like very promising for them. So hierarchies of various levels cut through, like it's present. Yeah.
Time for the last comment, if you want to.
Yeah, this actually isn't what I was going to ask, but now I'll ask it as a follow-up to that. So they're treating it as some of the Theravada countries, the Southeast Asian countries, treat Buddhism, where they have young men join temporarily and then ultimately they go back out into the world. Is that what's going on with some of these young women?
The young women who are serving in the convents, like as servants.
Oh, as servants.
Yes. They work as cooks, like
okay.
they don't. They're not like vowed women. Or
The men's orders have priests and brothers. Like the Jesuits would, even in the West, have these. The more educated ones, the better families would have literacy, and then they would study, become priests, and do the teaching of the parish work. And the brothers were from less educated backgrounds and would do the farming, the cooking, the cleaning, and so on. But
we had lay sisters, but that is not a practice that is continued. post 2000s, early 2000s.
see.
We had lay sisters till late 1990s.
Okay,
But another interesting thing is like the nuns from Kerala or like South Asia, they also serve in the seminaries or theological institutes in Rome. And that has come up in the interviews. Like, so this was reported to me, like the experience of another nun was
Yeah.
reported to me by my informant. And apparently, like this other nun who was working in Rome, one day called her and then came just to like rant about the kind of job she's doing in the seminary in Rome, because she was basically washing the clothes of priests and like working in the kitchen, clearing the plates and all that. So she was like, and the congregation also sends the nuns to the European seminaries to like work because it's like profitable for them in a way, because when the currency is like transferred, then it becomes, it makes more, So she was disappointed and she was considering leaving the vocation because she was like, this is not what I joined for, I can't. And a lot of the former nuns refuse to like go to church, but they are very pious and prayerful. They are like, why? So one of my respondents whom I had long multiple, we have a very good relationship. So she kind of tells me like, why would I depend on male mediated sacraments for having a connection with God? So these gendered discourses and the criticism against gendered hierarchy is very much present. But even then a lot of nuns choose to like go with it or conform to it, while a lot others.
well, we'll have to stop the formal discussion at this point. It's almost 1:30. I think perhaps if anyone wanted to stay and ask another question, we could continue talking, but otherwise we would have to stop here the formal session, and thank you, Anna, for a wonderful presentation.